Yesterday, we read about the resurrection. Jesus rose from the tomb, conquering death, hell, and the grave. Also, if you'll remember, Marconius has taken a leave of absence from his job as centurion and gone to search for Jesus and his followers. And he said that he would send word back and bring Vinegar Boy to see Jesus when he found him. So that's where we pick up in chapter 19. It was the 40th day since Jesus had risen, and Vinegar Boy worked in the hop fields with his sulfur pail and the small scoop. Sulfur protected the young plants from the hordes of tiny red spiders whose bite would sting the leaves and cause mildew or rot. Behind him, Amos, the overseer, was gently training the tendrils of the rapidly growing plants to climb the poles and trail across the interlacing ropes overhead. The vines must grow right, or the crop of cones in late summer would not hang correctly on the vines. Above the boy, the green terraces ascended the hill and ended at the low stone wall that separated the fields from the Bethany road. A small bird swooped under the ropes and, like a runaway shadow, flitted beneath the vines. The whistling wings passed close to old Amos and then brushed past the boy. The sparrow settled in a young mustard bush at the edge of the field. As the little bird broke into melody, the boy heard him. He set the pail of sulfur between the rows and stepped from the shade. The light breeze had thrown a dusting of the golden sulfur upon his hands and legs, and bits of brownish gold in his hair matched the happy sparks in his amber eyes. In a few more weeks, the entire hop field would be a sea of silvery green and yellow cones. Many things could ruin the hop harvest: a swarm of lice, a horde of red spiders, a chill night, a fall of hail. Once he had seen the vines ruined at the very last day. But he felt confident about this year's harvest. The pickers would fill their baskets with the cones. Then the hops would be spread on racks inside the drying oven, which had been rebuilt since the earthquake and the storm. After the cones were cooled, they were pressed into bags and carted to the commissary. Sometimes the pungent, bitter yellow powder called lupulin, which was deposited under the bracts of the hop flour, would be collected for the physician at the garrison. He would roll the powder into pills that would help ease a soldier's sour stomach or aid a restless man in going to sleep. Sparrow scolded and sang and waited impatiently in the mustard bush. "Why are you here?" the boy asked. "Why are you not gathering food for your children? You are a bad father, Sparrow." The bird ruffled his tail feathers and sang. Then he soared from the bush upward across the terraces to the stone wall. From the wall he sang and chirped and scolded. Before rising and winging toward Bethany and back again, his melodies tangled in his throat. Then Vinegar Boy knew. He should have known at once. Sparrow was telling him that Jesus was in Bethany. For a few days after Marconius's last note, he had spent half of his time watching the Bethany road. But little by little, he had become more absorbed in the work with the hops. There were people on the road now, and as he thought about it, he knew he had been hearing them for some time. Jesus had come back to see his friends in Judea. This is what Sparrow was saying. "Jesus is here. Jesus is here." He had come to tell his loved ones goodbye. As Vinegar Boy thought of what Marconius had said in his note, he paused for a moment. He wished he had time to run into the city and get Nicholas, but the steward had warned him not to waste time. He began to run up the hill, stepping on the stones of the terrace. People were coming from Jerusalem, moving in across the fields and from among the flocks and the cabbage patches. There was an orderliness and a quietness about their coming that struck the boy. All about them was an air of restrained excitement held steady by something that might be called sorrow or worship. The boy hesitated at the wall, trying to find a familiar face. The faces were all friendly, but there was no one he knew. He climbed over the wall and followed. Sparrow flew ahead. He was going to see Jesus, and he must get his miracle. But Marconius had said there were no reports of miracles. A group of children ran past him. One boy jumped to the wall and ran along, balancing himself, while his brother, a bit younger, tried to follow. The smallest of the children was a girl with clear blue eyes and cheeks as pink as oleanders. She stumbled, and her older brother yelled for her to hurry or she would miss Jesus. She began to cry, rubbing her chubby fists into her eyes. "Come on, little girl," Vinegar Boy said. "Let them walk the wall. I will walk with you." The younger brother tormented her. "Tamar's a crybaby, a crybaby." Her lower lip trembled, but she smiled at Vinegar Boy. "Did you know Jesus? I used to be sick all the time. He made me well. Did he heal you too?" Envy pricked in his heart. "No, I haven't been sick." "He's going away into heaven forever." Vinegar Boy nodded. The brothers jumped from the wall and were waiting. Tamar turned to him again. "Goodbye," she said. "I have to go now." She ran ahead, where he watched her chattering with the others. Once she looked back and smiled, the sun bright on her brown hair. Sparrow had hidden himself among the leaves of a fig tree, but his song betrayed him. The boy thought of Sparrow and their love for one another. But he had never held Sparrow in his hand. He had wanted to, but Sparrow would not trust him. Still, it wasn't necessary to hold something close in order to love it. These people haven't seen Jesus for many days, but they loved him. There was a spirit of love between Jesus and his friends, as there was a communion between himself and Sparrow. The boy felt another lift of joy within him. On ahead, a woman with red hair reminded him of Magdalene, but it wouldn't be Magdalene. She would be coming from Galilee with him. All the disciples had been in Galilee. He hoped he would see John and Mary. How happy she must be since her son was alive again. Would she cry when he went back to heaven? "Oh, who will bring me the lilies of the field? Who will press the star flowers into my hands and tell me that they match my eyes?" Her words from the crucifixion day rang in his ears as his eyes fell on a cluster of twinkling blue in the fields beyond the wall. He vaulted the fence, the stones warm under his hands. He plucked the flowers. Perhaps this was the very kind Jesus had picked for her. In the pasture below, the sheep drank from a quiet brook. The stems of the flowers were dry. If he could wet them and wrap them in some leaves, they would stay fresh. He cast a glance at the road. Perhaps he shouldn't linger, but he wanted fresh flowers for Mary. He scurried to the brook and knelt to wet the leaves. He saw his face in the clean water above the white pebbles. His ugly cheek showed dark and stained, purplish red like the hop seeds that were fit only to be thrown away. No vines were grown from the seeds, only from the sprouts. His birthmark was keeping Nicholas from believing in Jesus. Above him, the blue sky blazed and large white clouds began to roll. The willows moved and the water rippled, destroying the image of his face, but something caused his throat to ache. Sparrow swooped above him, scolding furiously. "Hurry, hurry!" The urgency was clear. Vinegar Boy leaped the fence and ran. Over the brow of the hill, the roadway was empty. Then he saw the gathering of people on the small grassy hillock in the field. Jesus must be there. The boy pushed through the crowd carefully so as not to crush the flowers. He didn't have time to find his friends, for Jesus stood in the midst of them, ready to speak. Vinegar Boy looked at him and sighed. Marconius was right. There were no scars on his face or forehead. His garments were shining white. Light played above his head, and the hair that had seemed dark on the cross in the rain held 1,000 bronze-red rays. Jesus lifted his hand. Silence fell. The sleeve of his robe fell back, and the boy gasped. The hand of Jesus held a scar, a small ragged mark, the shape and color of a ripe mulberry, marred the wrist. Jesus spoke, and his calm, triumphant, loving voice rang in the boy's heart from that hour forward. It was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer and be raised from the dead For in this were the scriptures fulfilled. For such purpose came I into the world. But now my time has come to return unto my Father which sent me. I came to do his will. In this can ye do his will also, that ye believe in me whom he has sent. I came as a physician to the sick, a counselor to the troubled. I wiped the tears of those who mourned and eased the hearts of those who grieved. I gave my life a ransom for many. It is not my Father's will that any who come to me shall be turned away. Beloved, it is expedient that I return unto my Father, but I will not let you remain comfortless. The Comforter, which I shall send in my name, shall abide with each of you. Tarry in Jerusalem until the power is sent. Thenceforth will the Spirit remind you of all the things which I have spoken. I say unto you, love one another, serve one another, for in this will you show forth that ye are my disciples. Rest in me, for your labors are ended. I am thy Sabbath and thy salvation. All power is given unto me in earth and in heaven. I was in the beginning, and I shall be forevermore. Go ye therefore into every nation, and preach the gospel according to the words which I have given thee. I go unto my Father, but I will come again. I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and shall be with you always, even unto the end of the world. As Jesus finished speaking, and while his hand was high in blessing, a dazzling light appeared out of the brightness about him. Clouds of purest white billowed and rolled beneath his bare feet. Above his head, trumpets sounded. The portals of heaven opened. Earth filled with humming, and those who had come to see him go dropped on their knees in the grass. Only a few kept their eyes fixed on the ascending Lord, and the boy heard the soft cry of a woman close at hand, "The angels! The angels from the tomb!" And he raised his eyes to see two men in white standing, one on either side of the hill. "Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing upward? This same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go." The brightness faded from the hill, and large white clouds overflowed the bowl of the sky. The murmuring of the multitude was like the wine of joy and the wine of mourning mingling in the same cup. The crowd dispersed slowly. Vinegar Boy lingered, the leaves about the blue flowers drying in his hand. He climbed to the top of the hill where Jesus had stood and saw that the grass was still bent where his feet had last touched the earth. The boy put his hand against the grass and felt a living warmth. What should he do with these flowers? The one woman who had called out about the men in white could have been Magdalene. Surely if John had been there, they would have seen one another, but no one had seemed aware of anyone except Jesus. On the road, the crowd had strung out so that only 2 or 3 walked together. At a Roman milepost, a young man waited. Vinegar Boy's heart leaped. It looked like John Mark. It was Mark, the boy who had been on the hill during the crucifixion. Mark hailed him with a grin. "I thought it was you. I wanted to thank you for your kindness on the hill that day." Mark's young beard had grown darker and stiffer, but his eyes, shining gray with the rim of black, were as warm as Vinegar Boy had known they could be. "Was John the fisherman here to see Jesus go?" he asked. Mark nodded. They were all here. "Is Jesus ever coming back?" "He said so, didn't he? We will have to wait. Until he does, he is sending the Holy Spirit to be with us. When the Spirit comes, Peter says we will be able to turn Jerusalem on its ear with our preaching." Who is Peter? The boy had wanted to know for a long time. "He is a fisherman the same as John. Jesus intended for him to be a leader among us, but he turned coward. On the night the temple guards and the mob arrested Jesus, Peter stood outside Pilate's porch and lied. He declared he was not a friend of the Galilean. It is said that he even cursed about it. Later, he repented and wept bitterly. He was one of the first of the men to see the empty tomb. Mark's voice grew a little proud. No one will ever have a chance to say that I failed him. Then he flushed and laughed. Go ahead, tell me I'm boasting. When I say things like that to Mother, she says I'm like a loaf that is rising too swiftly. Did Jesus forgive Peter? Of course. Jesus even knew it would happen. You see, Peter needed a lesson. Nothing will ever make him deny Jesus again. He's going to be as solid as a stone. His real name is Simon, but Jesus called him Peter, which means a rock. John told me. He said Jesus thinks names are important. Yes, I suppose so. I never have had a name. It was easy to talk to Mark. I was supposed to pick one after Jesus healed my face. I thought he'd be in the temple that day, the day of the crucifixion, the same as every other day. But it doesn't bother me as much anymore. But I have to pick a name so Nicholas will quit worrying about me. What's hard about a name? Mark said. There are hundreds of them. Vinegar Boy shook his head. It has to be the right one, but I know which one I want now. Do you think John would care if I borrowed his name? Mark laughed. Why borrow when you can have half of mine for nothing? Nobody calls me John except Mother. She would be glad to know that another boy actually wanted it. Vinegar Boy looked at Mark. The gray eyes were smiling warm and bright, and he felt the answering smile leap to his own face. Mark was giving him his name. Do you really mean it? You don't mind my having your name? I would be honored, Mark said in a very solemn old man way, and both boys burst into laughter. Later, as they walked side by side toward Jerusalem, Vinegar Boy said, What does the name John mean? Do you know? Well, Mother always said it meant God was good because he gave her a son, but I never thought it suited me. It's a little too gentle or something. Vinegar Boy's heart leaped. Nicholas would like the name, for he had often said the boy had come to him as a gift. I picked the flowers for Mary. Will you see her? He had almost forgotten the little blossoms, and when he held them out, they were slightly wilted. The blue had lost its twinkle, and some of the sulfur from his clothes had speckled the green leaves. But Mark smiled. I will give them to her, and I'll tell John that you have a name. And I'll tell Peter that you and Nicholas will be at the temple to hear his first big sermon after Jesus sends the power of the Holy Spirit upon us. Vinegar Boy laughed. Yes, we'll be there. They parted inside the city gates. A fleet shadow sailed past the boy and headed toward the nest in the eaves. A long worm trailed from Sparrow's beak. In all the homes where the believers lived, the business of the evening meal went on as usual. Already there were some who waited and watched for the Lord's return, not knowing that with God, 1,000 years could be as a single day. Chapter 20, and I'll give you a little hint. It's entitled Adoption Day. Marconius didn't reach Bethany in time to see Jesus exalted. He rode into the barracks at sundown with the white mare in a lather. His boots clumped heavily across the threshold as he called for Nicholas and the boy. Dust fell from the folds of his cloak. His cheeks were shadowed with beard and weariness, and he looked thin. As he sat at their table, Vinegar Boy loosened his bootlaces, and Nicholas set a bowl of freshly stewed figs before him. Marconius listened as the boy told him of the ascension. The small brown hands lifted as he told how the clouds swept under the Nazarene's feet and raised him upward toward golden gates that opened beyond the billowing white clouds. And he related eagerly the claims of the men in gleaming white robes who had told the people that Jesus would come again. He promised never to forsake us. How can he be in heaven with Dismas and down here with each one of us too? Vinegar Boy asked. I don't know, Marconius replied, but he knows. He knows everything. Each time a sparrow falls, even to the number of hairs on our heads. The boy laughed and ran his head over Nicholas's bald head. That would not be difficult with Nicholas. Nicholas chuckled and asked the centurion where he had been learning so much about the Hebrews' God. I talked to many in Galilee. I don't intend to quit inquiring about him. Such knowledge is like an empire of unspeakable riches. I'll never be like the mighty Alexander who had to weep because there were no more worlds to conquer. But you are not a Jew, Marconius. I've understood that Jehovah is a jealous God, reserving salvation for the Jews. The centurion leaned back and stretched. There were dust marks on the table where his arms had lain. The lamps were lit, and the dark eyes under the straight, dusty brows glowed with clean fire. There will come a time when I will sup at their table. They cannot count me unclean forever. Jesus is the master of the feast, and he has invited me to come. There will be a day of adoption for you? Is that it? Nicholas said softly. It could be, for such a time has arrived for the boy and me. We've been waiting for your return. You've picked a name at last? The boy smiled. I am to be called John, son of Nicholas. Marconius nodded. For John the fisherman, you have chosen well. That disciple is known as the one whom Jesus loves. You will see to the preliminaries for us as quickly as possible? Nicholas asked. Marconius promised. He brought word the next day that 2 weeks hence they were to see the judge. The night before the adoption, Vinegar Boy was too excited to sleep. He called Sparrow from the eaves and talked to him as the moon rode like a white-sailed galley over the towers of the fortress. He talked to Sparrow about his desire to be an honorable son. Putting his hand to his dark cheek, he said, Someday I will have 2 good cheeks. Dismas loved the sun, and Jesus took him to live where the sons are born. I will have a good face when it is time to have it. I think Jesus would like to have Nicholas believe in him before he heals me. We will not worry about it any more, will we? The sparrow bobbed its head sleepily, and tears warmed the boy's eyes. This was the last time he would ever cry about his ugly cheek. Sparrow fell asleep on the window ledge with his head against his wing. Vinegar Boy reached out a finger and touched the soft feathers of brown and black. Sparrow moved uneasily under the touch, as if the silver of the moonlight had grown heavy on his back. The boy smiled as he said, I would not harm you, Sparrow. Why do you not trust yourself to me? We are friends, you and I wish you only good. The bird slept on while the moonlight made a blanket for the sleeping boy. Adoption day dawned clear and bright. Nicholas spent the morning preparing himself and the boy with bathing and dressing. Marconius came from his officers' quarters in full regalia. A scarlet plume bobbed on a new silver helmet. Medals and medallions gleamed like small suns on his bronze breastplate. The lace eyelets of his boots had been hand-polished, and they twinkled like low-flying stars. His scarlet cloak, matching the plume, swung in folds, short at the sides but touching his heels when he stopped. Nicholas was stiff and uncomfortable in his new garment. Woven of fine linen, it was a soft shade of gray with heavily embroidered girdle of pale blue silk. His new freedman's cap covered his bald head, but the hair fringing the cap was snowy white and soft. He had oiled himself and cleaned his nails. There was no smell of labor upon him, and for a little while he seemed like a stranger to the boy. But the feeling passed as he saw the way Nicholas looked at him, and he began to laugh as the steward walked through the halls because Nicholas's new shoes squeaked like frightened mice. The boy wore a simple garment of creamy white cotton with a border of brown and gold threads around the squared neck. His hair, red-brown and shining, hung to his shoulders. Across his forehead it was cut short and lay high above the straight golden brows. He wore new shoes of softest leather, soft as the sparrow's feathers they seemed against his toes. He had tried to tell Nicholas that he was wasting his money on such fine shoes because they would be worthless in field or garden. So different they were from the boots that were laid away in the chest. When the day was done, he would put the new shoes and the new garments with the boots. He would keep them, and when he was old, he would open the chest and tell his children and his grandchildren about these days in Jerusalem, the one great day of sadness and the many days of gladness. At least, he supposed, he could have children and grandchildren. Most boys grew up to become fathers. This was the way of life, even for sparrows. He would probably never use the fine garment again, not unless Marconius got married. Neither he nor the steward had been aware that more than a search for knowledge about the Nazarene had drawn the centurion into Galilee. In the large marble hall of the magistrate's office, the three of them stood, the two a little embarrassed in their finery. "John, son of Nicholas," the judge intoned, and the boy felt his heart leap. Nicholas tried to hold the pen steady as he signed the papers. The boy signed his own name, proud that Nicholas had taught him to write. Marconius stood at attention until time to sign as a witness. He had verified all that Nicholas had told the judge and had added his own testimony as to the character of the steward. Vinegar Boy had been questioned too. Oh, yes, Nicholas was a good father. He had taken care of him ever since he was a baby and the soldiers had found him in the hills. His parents had thrown him away because he was ugly, but Nicholas loved him. He made him study and do his lessons. He taught him to choose good rather than evil. He had never beaten him or forced him to do slave labor. He would have gone on and on, but the judge held up his hand. Enough. Until now, I had believed all the gods resided on Olympus. Enough. The papers were signed and the signatures blotted with sand and shaken dry. Other papers were written by scribes, and they, in turn, were signed and blotted. Then the papers were sealed with a blob of wax, and the judge pressed the official seal of Rome upon the warm wax. One copy was given to Nicholas, who folded it carefully inside the pouch pocket of the woven girdle. Vinegar Boy held his copy almost reverently. The parchment was cool to his touch. The judge shook the steward's hand and congratulated him on a new son. He shook the boy's hand too and called him John. The judge's hand was soft and spongy, making the boy think of the fisherman's hand with its hard nest of calluses. Marconius shook their hands too, very officially, as if he were not their very best friend. His grip was hard and firm. On the way back to the fortress, they stopped at an inn where only the finest people were served. Nicholas ordered a pitcher of expensive juice, small hot loaves with tiny sausages, and a platter of apricots. But before they ate, he asked Marconius to ask his Lord's blessing on the new father-son relationship. Marconius laid a hand across the table. "Why not make my Lord your Lord, Nicholas? Surely his spirit has been speaking to you." The steward's face went pink and his eyes filled. His hand grasped John's, and the boy was almost too happy to eat. Another family was celebrating at a table near them. The girl was about the same age as John, with hair long and shining brown. Her eyes were big and dark, gentle as the eyes of a desert creature. She leaned across the table to speak to him. "Is it your birthday too?" Vinegar Boy swallowed. "No, it's my adoption day." The girl said, "Oh," in a funny little voice, and he saw her whispering to her mother. Was she talking about his face? He didn't think so. Maybe she didn't know what adoption meant because she had her own mother and father. A moment later, she left her table and came to him. In her hand, she held a golden ball of fruit. The boy had never seen anything like it. "Here," she said, "my mother says this is for your adoption day." At first, he shook his head, too embarrassed to take the gift from her. He could feel his good cheek getting as hot and red as his bad cheek. Then Nicholas leaned forward. "It's not polite to refuse to accept a gift given in kindness, son." So he took it and thanked her, and she said, "My name is Deborah." And he said, "Mine is John." And she went back to her table, but every now and then he looked up, and she would smile at him. The new fruit was cool to his hand. Marconius showed him how to peel it so that the inside fell apart into sections shaped like new moons. The fruit was juicy and sweet and the best thing he had ever eaten. The juice ran down his elbows and spotted his new garment, but Nicholas told him not to worry. That evening, as he went up the stairs to his room, he stood on the bottom step and said, very loudly so that Phineas would hear, "Peaceful dreams, Father." And Nicholas, who knew all things that the boy thought and who was only an arm's length away, answered in a roar that shook the walls, "The same to you, my son." The next day in the hop fields, John spent the morning weeding and pruning. The weeds grew quickly, almost as quickly as the young hop vines, but nothing grew as fast as the hops. There were people who were willing to swear that the young plants grew more than the length of a man's hand in a single night. And it could be so, for the vines fairly covered the rope arbor already. The blooms from the older vines made the fields a fragrant place. The boy had been whistling, and Sparrow had been with him most of the day, hopping among the rows, watching for worms that clung to the weeds. He ate the worms himself now, because his family had grown and left the nest. Now and then, as Sparrow paused for an instant between the rows, the boy would attempt to touch him, but the bird would hop sideways or backward, casting a reproachful eye at him. Then John would sing aloud to the bird, "I know a secret, a secret." And the sparrow tipped its head at him and looked up with inquisitive black eyes. "I know how your feathers feel, soft as moonlight, soft as goose down, softer than the white lamb's wool. I know how your feathers feel." Sparrow chirped angrily and dragged a resisting worm from a mass of roots. Later, as the bird fluttered and chattered merrily, the boy said, "You are happy too, little friend, but you rejoice because your family is gone, while Nicholas and I are happy because we are a family." The two of them left the hop fields in mid-afternoon. They came in past the grove of silvery green olive trees on the slopes of Gethsemane. Sparrow lifted himself on strong wings as the eastern gates came in view, and John began to whistle. He should be tired, but he wasn't. The sun had not burned him because the leaves of the hops covered the trellis. His heart was as full of happiness as the golden fruit had been full of juice. He began to run and jump and was breathing fast and perspiring as he burst through the barracks gate and yelled, "Father!" Nicholas came out at once as if he had been waiting for him. He wore a clean apron and his face beamed. He was bursting with a secret. "Hurry, John, we have a guest." When the boy stepped through the door and saw Mark, he wanted to hug him in joy, but he was beginning to think that he was too old to hug people. So he thrust out his hand. Mark's face was shining the same as the steward's. They were both conspirators with a marvelous surprise. Mark's gray eyes were luminous as moons, and his beard had been trimmed and oiled just like a man's. John looked at both of them and said, "What is it? What's the surprise?" "Never mind," Nicholas said. "We aren't going to tell you yet. You get cleaned up. We're going with Mark." "Where?" "Don't ask questions. Do as I say." Mark laughed. "We can tell you this much. There's somebody who wants to see you." "Who?" "John the fisherman." Gladness almost closed the boy's throat. He